Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Exorcist series with Exorcist the Beginning. Now, Exorcist the Beginning came out in 2004, and this, of course, is a prequel to William Friedkin's 1973 masterpiece, The Exorcist, which, of course, was based on the William Peter Blatty novel of the same name. Now, in The Exorcist, you found out that years before the events of that movie, Father Merrin actually performed an exorcism in Africa, and they touched on this a little bit in Exorcist 2, The Heretic, and for years, Morgan Creek and Warner Brothers have been talking about doing a prequel to The Exorcist about the exorcism that Father Merrin performed in Africa. Now, originally this film was actually going to be directed by John Frankenheimer, who was perhaps most famous for films like The Manchurian Candidate and The French Connection 2, and he also directed the film Black Sunday, which was an adaptation of the Thomas Harris novel, and he also directed the 1979 horror film Prophecy, which is one of my personal favorites. But Frankenheimer was a really good director, and he probably could have done a really good job with this movie, but unfortunately he stepped down because he was very sick at the time and he ended up dying. And originally, Liam Neeson was actually going to play the role of the young Father Merrin in this movie, and Liam Neeson, I'm sure, would have nailed his role as Merrin, but unfortunately he didn't end up playing the character. Eventually, the directing job went to Paul Schrader, and Stellan Skarsgård was cast as the young Father Merrin, and a movie was actually shot called Dominion, but unfortunately, Morgan Creek and Warner Brothers were not satisfied with this movie at all, so what ended up happening was they ended up hiring somebody to rewrite the script for Dominion, and they hired Renny Harlin to come in and reshoot the entire movie and basically remake Dominion as this movie, Exorcist the Beginning. Now, before this, Renny Harlin directed films like A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, and Die Hard 2, and The Long Kiss Goodnight, and Deep Blue Sea. So basically, Exorcist the Beginning is a reshot version of the movie Dominion, which was directed by Paul Schrader. Now, when this movie came out, it bombed hard, so after this movie failed miserably in the box office, Morgan Creek ended up releasing the film Dominion under the title Dominion Prequel to The Exorcist in 2005. So, there are two prequels to The Exorcist, this movie and the movie Dominion. Now, both films more or less have the same story to them, and both films have Stellan Skarsgård playing the character of Father Merrin. Now, I guess which one would count as canon would really depend on which one you like better. Like, in my opinion, it's kind of up to the individual which prequel is actually canon or not. Now, Dominion is actually going to be my next movie review, so I'll give more of my thoughts on that movie in that review, but what I will say is I actually think both prequels have their strengths and both have their weaknesses, and I actually do like both movies for different reasons, but I also think both films are very flawed movies. Now, the plot of Exorcist the Beginning is it's set in the year 1949, obviously years and years before the events of the original film, and it follows the character of Lancaster Merrin, or Father Merrin as he was known in the original film, but in this movie, at the time it takes place, he's actually no longer a priest. You find out later on in the movie that he was a priest during the Second World War, but because of what he witnessed the Nazis doing during the Second Second World War, he lost his faith in God, and during the events of this movie, he's actually an archaeologist. Now, in the film, Merrin is sent to do this excavation of a church in East Africa, which is literally buried, and he has to, like, dig it out. But when they go into this church, it appears that this is not a church of God, but a church of the devil. And it appears that this church has a supernatural curse on it, and throughout the film, supernatural things start happening to Father Merrin and people around Merrin, and eventually somebody that Merrin knows does end up getting possessed by a demon, and you find out later on in the movie that there's a legend that this place where the church is built on it might actually be the place where Lucifer fell after he was cast out after the war in heaven. Now, a lot of people absolutely despise this movie, but as I said before, I actually do kind of like the movie. Like, I really don't think this film is that bad. Believe me, I don't think it's great by any means, but I really don't think it's that bad of a movie. I do think the other prequel, Dominion, in terms of the story, even though both films more or less have the same story, I do think Dominion is better written, because the thing about Dominion is Dominion was a very quiet, very subtle film, while this film is very loud and bombastic. Like, it's really, like, over the top, and Dominion was a much more psychological horror film, but this film is much more in your face and is a lot gorier. Like, you can tell this is definitely a studio horror film, but for what it is, I really don't think it's that bad. But this film definitely has its problems. Like, there's a lot of really shitty CGI effects in this movie, and also, like, at the end of the movie, basically in the film, you see Father Merrin start to regain his faith in God, and at the end of the film, he does perform an exorcism on the person who ends up getting possessed by the demon at the end, but the exorcism at the end is so cheesy and so over the top, because, as he's saying, the exorcism rites, I mean, you see the person possessed by the demon running through this dark tunnel, and it's flailing its arms around, and it's so freaking unintentionally hilarious. Like, it's just so freaking ridiculous. And there are a lot of other problems with the film. Like, as I said, it's very loud and bombastic, and it really does kind of throw subtlety out the window. And one of the things that made the original The Exorcist such a great film was the fact that it was a very reality-based movie. Yes, it was a supernatural film, but it was kind of like saying, like, okay, if demonic possession really did exist, this is probably how it would be. Like, it was a very reality-based film, while this film pretty much just throws reality out the window and is almost in the realm of fantasy horror. But for what this film is, I really don't think the film is that bad. Like, I really do like the scenes that take place during World War II, where you see Father Merrin, like, actually being forced by the Nazis to pick out certain people for the Nazis to shoot, and it really is a very intense scene, but a lot of those scenes of Father Merrin during the Second World War were actually taken from the original version of this film, Dominion. And I do think Stellan Skarsgård does a phenomenal job in this movie as the character of Merrin. And I would say for the most part, this film is relatively well acted and is relatively well made, with the exception of some of the really shitty CGI effects that are in the film. But in general, I would say Exorcist: The Beginning is an okay film. Like, I definitely don't hate it. Like, I do actually kind of like this movie, but I can understand why some people really, really don't like this film. But I would recommend it mainly out of curiosity. However, I do think the film Dominion is a better film, even though Dominion also has a lot of problems as well. So yeah, that's my review of Exorcist: The Beginning, and my next movie review will be Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist.